So I want to take you on a tour today. I want to show you some of the places in this cemetery that really talk about a community and what a community is all about. And you'll get a sense of that. Some of them famous people, some of them not so famous people. Burnt Hills. The land of the Burnt Hills, a name given to this area by the Dutch settlers of Schenectady in the 1600s. Schenectady actually had three different names. It was originally Squanoctady, which means the land beyond the pines, because many of the Indians lived in the pine-infested areas of Albany, and this was beyond those areas. Then it became Schenectady, which is by far the easiest of the three to spell. And then the English came in and anglicized it to Schenectady, which is by far the hardest to spell. I always worry about those young kids in Schenectady elementary schools learning to spell Schenectady. That's not easy at all. The land of the Burnt Hills, they looked up at the hills from Schenectady and they saw that the hills were afire up here. And they were afire because the Indians knew that if they burned the brush, the deer would be attracted as the new shoots came up out of the ground. And then they could shoot the deer and kill them. So the name comes from the people of Schenectady looking at the hills. Or, if you'd like a more ominous story, there is a story out there, all folklore, I can't prove it to you, that white man was out hunting in the woods in this area. He came across, these two white men came across some Indians who had also been out hunting, and they'd already killed a couple of deer. And they had pelts thrown on their shoulders. So the white man came up with a brilliant idea that they could do less work if they stole the pelts from the Indians. So they stole the pelts, killed the Indians, and then burned the area to cover up their crime. Now, most white people don't like that story because it makes us look bad. I don't know whether it's true or not. And I don't know whether the other one is true. They're both folklore, and they're not ones we will ever prove. But Captain William Kingsley was one of the early settlers here in the land of the Burnt Hills. And he had been a captain in the British Army, yes, the British Army, but he moved into this area at some point, and we don't know exactly when. He established a tavern just up the road a little ways. And that was a very smart place to have a tavern because it was halfway in between Schenectady and Saratoga. And people would stay there overnight because it took a long time by stagecoach from Schenectady to Saratoga. So he had a two-story building. The building still stands at the corner up here at Kingsley and Lake Hill. And he would have the guests stay on the first floor and the help would stay on the second floor. The place was so popular, not only with tourists and people going north, but also with locals, that they had to replace the floor many, many times. I imagine it was like pine flooring, which would disintegrate very quickly. So there's a record that it was replaced many, many times over the years. But Mr. Kingsley lived there for a number of years, died in, don't remember what year, 1849. He did not own the tavern that whole time. It went by other names over time, but it was a tavern probably into the 1850s. Had a number of people in his family here. He was living in a loyalist part of town, even though he opened the tavern 10 plus years later than the Revolution. There's still hatred between loyalists and the rebels. The rebels were over further in that side of the town, so it really wasn't a problem at all. Kingsley Road is named for him and for his ancestors who lived here. Not a real famous man, famous only because he has a road named for him. Most of the stones in this cemetery, like this one, do not have fascinating phrases on them. Once in a while you'll see something, but it's not common. If you go to Briggs Cemetery, up in Ballston Spa, there is one stone on a little girl named Sarah Caroline Griswold. She died at 8 years old in 1824, and on her stone it says, "Killed by the accidental discharge of a musket." Those of you who live around this area, you know Shawber Road, named for the Shawber family. The Shawber house still stands. It's actually in the town of Clifton Park. Big house. It's been renovated many times over the years. David Shawber is one of the beginning people in this church, the Baptist church that now sits here. The church started with about 10 to 15 families. It started by meeting in the Shawber family barn. And that was a unique kind of situation, so much so that we have a record that indicates that one of the churches in Stillwater mentioned that church being in a barn at its beginning. So we're pretty famous from that perspective. The Shawber family was instrumental in the creation of this building. Probably started in the 1780s in the barn. Then they decided they needed a church. So they started by building a wooden building down that way, probably about a half a mile, probably in the vicinity of where Fo'c'astle Farms is located now. That wasn't good enough. They wanted to build something better. So they got this piece of land up in here and they started building a church. This is the early 1800s. Well, after they got part of it built, and they're building this by themselves, by hand, the westward movement started. 1801, the Louisiana Purchase. Well, by 1806, many of the people who were working on this building left to go out west because that's where the future was. And that's where you could make big bucks, and that's where you could get lots of land. So all work stopped on the church. Eventually, they start working on it again, but it takes 20 years to build that building because of that. And of course, it's being done by them. David Shawber had a lot to do with that. So he is the beginning of the church in this area. Anytime anybody has questions, feel free to raise your hand and let me know, and I'll be happy to try to answer them for you as well. Go ahead.
In memory of, so he's not really buried there.
He may not be. We have no records at all of this cemetery because cemetery associations are supposed to pass their information from one person to the next. Somehow it didn't happen. This is the gravesite of Smith Hollister. He was buried here when he was about 8 years old. Before this was probably even a cemetery. The Hollister family lived in this entire area. Again, those of you who live around here know there's a Hollister Drive, Hollister Street, back over in here, named for the family. There were Hollisters who lived along this side of what is today Kingsley Road. There were Hollisters up on Lake Hill Road. One of the later Hollisters, Katie Hollister, actually gave money for Calvary Episcopal Church to buy the, or actually I think he gave them the land for the church itself. So they were a very wealthy family. They established a wallpaper factory up on Lake Hill Road back in the 1800s. And that wallpaper factory, the people wanted a church. And that was the creation of Calvary Church. But what I want to mention most here at Smith Hollister's grave, 1782 or 84, somewhere right around in there. This is a footstone. Now, a lot of you probably have seen footstones before and you know about footstones. They are very uncommon in this cemetery. I don't think there's another one in this cemetery. But people who are less knowledgeable about cemeteries always think it's another gravestone that just has no name on it. But it's not. It's a footstone. And many years ago, one of the things that was done by historians and scientists is they would measure in some of the bigger cemeteries in some of the big cities this distance. And by taking that distance, they could get a sense of how tall people were. And they figured that based on that information, people of the 1700s were about 3 to 4 inches less tall than we are today. So considerably different. However, there has been research in recent years that totally disproves that. and that people back then probably were maybe an inch shorter, but not much more than that. So the difference is not significant. What is significant is the difference in height between Americans and Europeans. Europeans were much shorter, and that supposedly had to do with nutrition. And that seems kind of contradictory, because in today's world, Americans are the ones that are not eaten really nutritiously, whereas Europeans tend to be better at that. So it's very different from what it is today. So that whole theory has been debunked over the course of time. And you find that with history, is it keeps changing. Even though you think you have all the information and you know everything there is to know about something, something will come along and disprove what you have come up with. And so history is not dead, boring, dry. It's really exciting because it keeps changing. The Bettis family. It's buried right in here. There's also some other Bettis up in the front of the cemetery. Don't know for sure whether they're related or not. They may be. The most famous of the Bettis family was Joe. Joe was a young guy. At the point I'm going to talk about, he's about 22 years old, 25 years old, maybe, something like that. It was the time of the American Revolution. And Joe didn't like the British much. He wanted the British out of here. And he wanted to do anything he could to get rid of the British. His father disagreed. His father was a loyalist. His father believed that you never go against the crown. You never go against the British king. I can only imagine the kinds of arguments that must have happened in that family. Some of you who are of the same vintage as I am remember some of the arguments in our houses over the Vietnam War. Not fun, not pretty. Well, finally, Joe got so fed up that he decided to leave home. He had to get away from his father, who ran a tavern on Route 50. If you came south on Route 50, you passed right by his house. It still sits there. It's identified as the Betty's Tavern, I believe. And it's a concrete house, mostly concrete, with the second floor is very short. It looks like the windows are very small on it, which is very often the way they built houses in the 1700s. It was an inn and a tavern. There's an old fireplace in it that goes back to the 1770s, I think. The rooms upstairs are little rooms, because rooms in inns were very small at that time. You didn't need a very big room, certainly nowhere near as big as motel rooms that we rent today. Joe decided to leave. Joe goes north. He goes to the Lake Champlain area and up into Canada. He fights with the rebel side because he wants the rebels to win. He fights with Benedict Arnold, who, as some of you are probably aware, is getting a whole new look in terms of history these days, because despite the fact that he was a traitor, and that's an awful thing, he did some really remarkable things in battle. He was an exceptional man in charge and did remarkable things at the battles of Saratoga as well. So he's getting a very different look. Joe Bettis does some remarkable things, particularly up in Canada. He believes, just like Benedict Arnold did, that he should be rewarded for his deeds and that he should be upped in rank in the military. Well, he was not. So in return for that, he switched sides. He became a traitor. And he started delivering rebel information to the British side. After doing this for quite some time, he got captured. He was taken to Albany. He was put on trial by the rebel tribunals. In the middle of the trial, George Washington, the commander-in-chief, comes to his assistance. And he argues that Joe should be let go. What basically happened is that Joe got a slap on the wrist. Don't do it again, Joe. George Washington wanted that, and George Washington held great power. So Joe, of course, doesn't listen. Just goes about spy messages again and just keeps right on doing what he was doing. Finally, he's walking through Jonesville. He walks by a group of men who are sitting around a fire in the middle of the woods. They recognize him. Now, this is how notorious he was by that point. There's no such things as faces on the milk cartons back then. I mean, somehow they knew his face. And they decided they were going to capture him. And as they grab him and take him into custody, a citizen's arrest kind of thing, he grabs a wad of paper out of his pants pocket, throws it in the fire. They retrieved it quickly and realized it's more spy information he's passing on to the British. Joe is taken to Albany. He's put on trial. George Washington does not intercede this time. He is sentenced to die. He is sentenced to hang for his crime. And he is buried in a pauper cemetery someplace in Albany. Never would they identify his grave. That would not be done. We have no idea where he's buried. But there's one more piece to that story. And there are two conflicting historical reports over exactly what happened at his hanging. One says that when he was standing on the platform with the noose around his neck, he jumped off the platform so that he would hang himself rather than be hanged. The other story is that his father pulled the rope that hanged him. I can't tell you which is true or if either for sure is true. They're both pretty horrifying in their own context. This marker I had placed here a number of years ago, 2013, 10 years ago, as an honor to his parents. It's hard enough to lose a kid, but to have a kid who is a traitor has got to be even more difficult. And I'm thinking about that crazy man who killed a whole bunch of people on Long Island, who has just been captured after, what, is it 10 years or something? And I read an excerpt this morning about how his parents are horrified and devastated by what their son has done. It's got to be an awful, awful thing to go through. So the Betty's family went through this. There are actually two markers, this one, and there's one on the Betty's house. And I understand that Clifton Park is about to put one, I think, in the area where he was captured. Valentine Bub. Valley lived on Scotch Bush Road. He was of German descent, actually. And this guy did a lot of stuff in this community. He worked for Johnson's store, which is just up the street here a little ways. He worked for a farmer on Good Street. He helped to start the Neptune Fire Department, which is now the Burnt Hills Fire Department. So he did a lot of really neat things and important things. When he worked at the farm on Good Street, one of his jobs was to take care of the dead animals, burying the dead animals. And he would bury them, we don't know exactly where because they didn't keep any records of that kind of thing. But since I lived kind of right behind where he worked, I used to harass the hell out of my children when they were young, that they were riding their bikes on the road right over the top of dead animals. But he was also responsible for bringing the animals in. That house had big, huge, kind of looked like garage doors that opened like this. And the animals, when it was really, really cold at night, would be brought into the lower level of the house so they could stay warm overnight. And those doors, I think, are still on that house. It still stands back from the 1770s. But Valentine Bub also was the postmaster from 1951 to 1957 at the Burnt Hills Post Office. Now, I point him out. He did a lot of things, But he's not a famous person. He's not a Joe Bettis. He's probably not even of the caliber of a Captain Kingsley, who had military record. He's sort of an ordinary person, just like all of us are. Yet I'm standing here telling you his story. And my question for you is, have you recorded your story? Because you too have a story. And 100 years from now, it won't be me, but it'll be somebody else telling your story. Lane Rowe. Lane Rowe was 11 years old. He lived down Blue Barns Road a little ways. You remember this story? It's not a pleasant story. His van that his parents had was parked facing into the house on a hillside, and they would back out on the hillside into Blue Barns Road when they were going out. Well, one day there were 4 or 5 kids in the car. Mom was in the driver's seat. Mom forgot something inside the house. And she went back into the house to get it. Somehow, and it could be that she left the car in gear or in neutral, the car started rolling backwards. Lane, who was, I believe, the oldest at that point, decided he had to do something about this. So he got out of the van, went behind the van to try to stop it, and got run over and killed. It was a horrible, horrible event, and it tore the family to shreds in the years after. When was this? 2012, so it's almost 10 years ago. They no longer live on Blue Barns Road. I don't know where they live at this point. But I do remember that he was in 6th grade at the time. I was teaching 7th and 8th graders, so I didn't know him. But his 6th grade had a field trip that day to someplace. And as I walked into school at 7 a.m. in the morning and looked at the 6th grade teachers who knew what had happened with this incredibly stricken look on their faces, and they were at that point deciding they would not tell the 6th graders anything until the end of the day because they didn't want to destroy the field trip, and they didn't know what would happen if they told anything. So they didn't. And when everyone came back to the school, they got them all together and they told them that Lane had been killed. It was one of the hardest things those teachers have ever had to do. This is one of the multiple graves of the Van Voorst family. And I point this one out because it's 2 people who died, Sarah and Jesse, within a very short time of each other. Can't give you the date on that. Can't read it on there right now, but it's late 1800s, early 1900s, probably. 1930? Okay, thanks. 1830? Should be later than that.
1890.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Birth, death, marriage records are started in the state of New York in the 1880s. Before that, there's no official record of birth, death, and marriage. So if you're ever looking for ancestors and looking for birth, death, marriage records, you won't find it in New York before the 1880s. And some states still don't do it. So you can get records from that point. Well, I picked these 2 because they are after the record-keeping date. And I can look up what happened to them based on the death records that we have. So one of them died of dysentery. One of them died shortly thereafter of heart failure caused by acute dysentery. I have actually gone through the cemetery and documented examples of people who have died within very few days or even months of each other. Unfortunately, I can't prove the death cause on most of them because they're too far back. This one I happen to be able to do. You will see that repeatedly in cemeteries, that whole families are wiped out by epidemics. Very, very common, horrible thing to have happen in your family, but very common. I think also to a certain degree, people, when you go back 100 plus years, accepted death a lot more than we do. They really did. It was a part of life. And as awful as it was, and as unfortunate as it was, it just happens. We tend to keep a lot of people alive longer. And we've got a lot of medical advances that have been wonderful. So this is an example of that kind of a situation. You'll see others here. Sir?
If I can read it correctly, one says August 27th, the other says September 8th, so that's only 12 days apart.
Yeah.
1890.
Yeah, it's really close. I mean, that's sad. That's really sad. Getting over one and then the other one dies. Can't imagine it. Okay, a couple of others of note. This is the grave of Richard O'Rourke, who was the superintendent of the Burnt Hills Ballston Lake Schools for 25 years. The longest running superintendent we ever had. And in today's world, 25 years never happens with superintendents because it was a difficult job when he was doing it. It's even worse now. It's a really tough job. Richard O'Rourke had the ability to work with everybody, including teachers' unions, staff members, students. He had an incredible ability to work together with people. He also saved my job a couple times because I was on the cutting block because of lower enrollments that were happening, and I was the low man. And he saved my job and finagled some things that probably would not be allowed in today's world. But I am deeply indebted to him. Gately family has a whole lot to do with the Burnt Hills area for many, many years. Minnie Gately, those of you who have been in Forecastle Farms, she passed away in '08, so it's a while back now. But if you were in Forecastle Farms before that, there was a little short lady with kind of reddish colored hair. She was always in there. She worked all the time. She worked there until she was 90 years old, I think. She just loved working there, and everybody knew Minnie Gately. Well, Minnie Gately's husband, Ralph, had a brother. And that brother, no, it may have been Minnie's brother, owned a gas station on Route 50. One day, he just decided he didn't want to run this gas station anymore. And you know this story? Yes. He up and left. He moved to California, and he lived under a bridge for the rest of his life in San Francisco, California. Loved it. Absolutely loved it. No responsibilities. Didn't have to worry about anything whatsoever. Well, at one point while he was living under this bridge, the gas station, which he had just left, got sold for, I think it was like $16,000, which sounds ridiculous in today's world. A gas station on Route 50 selling for $16,000. They had to find him because he was entitled to this $16,000. Well, finally, a lawyer did find him in California, and the man said, "I don't want the money, keep it." And he just continued to live under the bridge until he passed away.